Hello. My name is Oisín Quinn. Nice to meet you. How's it going? And I am here to talk about JavaScript and why it is actually a good thing, and a good programming language and all that crack. So I'm going to fire away here. First of all, hi, how's it going? Nice to meet you. My name is Oisín. I studied computer science in UCD. I was pretty involved with UCD NetSoc for 2 years. Then I graduated last year, and now I am doing lots of fun front-end stuff at a company called HubSpot. So first of all, I'm not an expert. Second of all, 10 minutes is a really short amount of time, and I'm going to be going into not too much depth about things. Hopefully I won't be rushing too much, but yeah. First of all, everybody seems to hate JavaScript, and that is the one thing I've learned from my time studying computer science. JavaScript is just hated by everyone. I'm involved in the UCD NetSoc server, and the amount of times people have just said bad things about JavaScript, which are deserved, to be fair. Bad quirks that JavaScript and funky stuff it can do. Lots of examples of that. But even outside of NetSoc, in the wider TypeScript community or JavaScript community, or the computer science community, there's lots. JavaScript is always the butt of the joke, I guess. I'd like that not to be the case. I think JavaScript gets a lot of negative attention, which I don't think is completely deserved. So all the people who say those things are wrong, and it's really important that you remind them that every time, because JavaScript is not bad, it is good. My favorite things about JavaScript, I think one of my favorite things is just the syntax is really nice, and I just love writing and reading and just everything to do with JavaScript. I'm a big fan. If I talk a bit about objects, so objects are kind of key in JavaScript, and I just think they look great. So here I've got a person object, and I'm just defining, okay, here's the age, here's the name, and then I can say the address is another object, and I can just nest these objects inside each other, without any hassle or anything like that whatsoever. And if this syntax looks familiar, yeah, it looks like JSON because it nearly is JSON. JSON is based off JavaScript. That's what the JS stands for. And if I want to access the postcode inside this person, I can just go person.address.postcode, and it just looks really nice. It works really easily. You might ask, okay, what happens if address doesn't exist? Okay, that will cause some errors, but I will talk a bit about how you can kind of avoid things like that later on. And then another thing is object destructuring. So I have this person variable here, which is an object, and I want to reach into it. So I can use this destructuring syntax here to reach into it and grab the age and store that as a variable. I can grab the name and then rename that variable to my name and save that. Or I can go into the address and go into the address then and then grab the country. So this is just a really nice way, I find, of getting an object or getting a response from an endpoint of some sort, and just taking out exactly what you need, and then you can just use it like that. Big fan of objects. I won't say much about this, but there's string literals in JavaScript. It used to be really messy how you wanted to put a variable inside an existing string. You used to have to do stuff like this. Now you can just use the backtick and put your variable in there, or you could add extra white space, and it's all respected whenever you run the code. Arrow functions. So JavaScript is a oldish language. It's from the 90s. I guess isn't that old, but I'm also from the 90s, I guess. So you can define functions like this, which is the old way, or you can use this new arrow function syntax, where I can just say, okay, I have a square variable, and it is equal to this function that takes in a parameter, and it returns just whatever the code is. It runs the code between those curly brackets. But I can simplify this even more into just this single line where I'm saying square is equal to, it takes in a width and returns the width by the width. I think this looks great. I'm a big fan of this, how concise it is and how easy it is to read what's going on. And then you can just call it like any other function. But then you can see here, since this is a variable, I can copy it to another variable, or I can pass it in as a function or as a parameter to another function, or I can add it as an attribute on an object. And I think it's really cool how you can just pass functions around without any hassle or any bad stuff like that. So big fan of how functions work in JavaScript. There's other cool stuff you can do. So you can have default values for parameters. So this here generates a greeting where it's just returning a string that says, hey, username, welcome. And say if I pass in Oisín, it'll say, hey, Oisín, welcome. But say I don't pass in anything, say that we don't know what the user's name is yet, or someone forgets to like pass in a certain parameter, it'll say, hey, anon, welcome, which I think is really handy of just, it's just a really nice way of having these fallbacks in scenarios where fallbacks make sense. But you could also, if you want to, you could pass in an object as the parameter instead. So what's actually happening here is it's taking an object that has a username and days since last visit, and it will destructure that using the syntax from earlier to turn these into variables pretty much, and then I can just access them just like this. And this is really useful for when you have functions that are taken in like 5 or 6 parameters or something like that. Or you want it to be really clear when reading the code what is exactly happening. So if you see this here, it's really clear that the 2 means it's been 2 days since the last visit. And if you're using just normal like syntax like this, it's not entirely clear what these parameters are being used for unless you dive into the actual function that's being called. So like you won't want to use this all the time, but in certain scenarios, it's really cool and handy. There's lots of cool things you can do with arrays in JavaScript. So say you have any array, you have all these like helper functions associated with the arrays. So I found this on Twitter recently. It's kind of pseudocode, but I can say for every element inside this array, I want to map it to something else. I want to change it in some way, or I want to filter. I only want to take out certain objects from this array that like pass whatever like function you put into it. I think these are just really handy and like really nice to use. You can do pretty much anything with JavaScript if you want to. You can like you can just use this one language to make like a front end, make a website that's like interactive, or like a full scale web app that does like solve real problems. Or you can make a back end with like Express and Node.js. You can make mobile apps with React Native. I don't really know about games and AI. I haven't seen much of that, but I think it's really cool how you can like use this one language to do so much stuff. Doesn't mean you should, I guess, is the catch. Like if you're making like an enterprise level like iOS app that needs to like have all these native features, like maybe React Native doesn't make the most sense. Maybe you're best off writing an app in like Swift instead. But I just love how you have that opportunity. Also, there's always new features being developed. There's a committee called TC39 that's made up of like industry people and open source contributors. And pretty much anyone can go to this repo and they can write a proposal of a feature that they think would be really cool to have in JavaScript. And you just like make up a README and you put in like the rationale and like what it would actually look like. I think that's really cool how anyone can go and like add to JavaScript and it's all decided on a community level to see like, is this something we actually want? I think that's great. Okay, sometimes JavaScript can get a bit chaotic, to be fair. It's not perfect. It's definitely not perfect. I'm stressing it is not perfect. Especially things with like, since there's no real types, you're messing around, or like there are types, but they're not really clear when you're like writing or reading code. You could have something you pass in a string instead of when you actually want to pass in a number. And like that gets a bit messy. There's lots of funky stuff going on here, which I don't really want to get into if I can help it. But what I find like the hardest thing with JavaScript sometimes is when you have a big function or like a big like piece of code and you're not really sure what's going on. Say I want to do something with this cached object, but like I don't really know what that is. Like it's not clear what, even if that's an object or what, and like I can go through the code and like I'm not really seeing much. So there's one like really great way of like fixing some of these annoying JavaScript things, and that is to add types with this lovely TypeScript Blue. So TypeScript is a language that is built on top of JavaScript, which is really important. So every bit of JavaScript you write is also valid TypeScript, but it adds types, which like is one of the biggest problems with JavaScript sometimes. So if we just zoom in on like that code snippet there, you can see this fixes the problem from earlier where you have a user object and like you don't know what exactly you can access on it. in TypeScript, if you try to get something that doesn't exist, it will complain. So I think that's great. So my conclusion is that JavaScript is a good language and it's got really nice syntax and all these great things, but you can make it even better if you make it TypeScript. And learning TypeScript, if you know JavaScript, you pretty much know most of TypeScript already. Just to finish up, some resources. If you're new to JavaScript and you want to understand the mental model a bit better, this website, justjavascript.com, it's actually an email newsletter that like just goes into like a great mental model for understanding JavaScript. And there's also this talk called What, which is just a comedy talk, pretty much just talking about the bad things or the crazy things you can do with JavaScript. Okay, that's me. Thanks for listening. The code samples are here. I also have them in TypeScript. If you want to see these slides, you can go to that website. And then I am Oisín_Q_ on Twitter. It's the only social media I really use. Cool. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. I learned a lot about JavaScript that I didn't know before. One of the things which was in your first when you were showing where you were on Blast for it, where you revealed that sorting an array of numbers sorts them alphabetically.
Yeah, that is one I noticed recently when I was actually working, is because it expects you to pass in strings, so it's not great. But it's those kind of things. If like you're dealing with, if you use TypeScript, it'll like tell you these things. It'll show you like the JS doc to see, show you exactly what these things do. But that's like a particularly bad thing in JavaScript. That is probably like a relic from like 20 years ago.
Yeah. It was really cool going through the examples. In fact, like I really liked the one, I think it was destructuring you called it, where you could well, I know it as unpacking, but normally in other languages you can only unpack sort of like tuples or arrays. It was really cool to see that you could unpack a whole object into something a bit more. What out of what you presented do you find most useful to yourself on kind of like a day-to-day basis?
I think like I use object destructuring like every single day, like especially when I'm like dealing with React and I've got like props, like it's just so much like easier, and I think it looks really good. I just love how it like it's really intuitive exactly what's happening, and like you can go into like objects inside of objects and like take out what you need. But you do need to be like careful, like it's JavaScript, you've got things like null and undefined that like you need to be careful with because you don't have types. But then TypeScript like kind of gets rid of that problem because you know exactly what you're dealing with.
Well, that actually leads me on to like, at what point did you realize that TypeScript was the thing you have to move to? And when did you make that move?
So it's really, I think around Christmas, I was doing the Advent of Code challenge, and like I had heard all these good things about TypeScript. I was like, might as well give this a go. And like, it just gets rid of like the biggest pain point in JavaScript for me is just dealing with objects that you don't understand, especially when you've got like, you're working in industry, like you've got code that was written years ago that you don't understand. And like, it just means, you know exactly what you're dealing with at every stage. And I really love that. So I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. In terms of like, why do you think, or sorry, I'm gonna start again. Why do you think people have this sort of like disdain for JavaScript? Do you think there's any reason, or?
So like JavaScript, like historically has not been great. Like if you think back to things like jQuery or like JavaScript from like, the 2000s or even like the early 2010s, like it really wasn't great. A lot of what I showed, most of what I showed in this presentation, like didn't exist. Like since like 2014, 2015, there's been like so many like big changes. It's probably down to like modern browsers coming onto the scene and like Chrome and all that crack. But like there's been real effort to like modernize. And I think things like in JavaScript move like really fast historically, and like I think it's kind of stabilized a bit recently. But I think those new features like get rid of like most of the annoying things, and then like languages like TypeScript on top of that just like make it even like nicer and safer to use.
Entirely. It's been really very interesting seeing how JavaScript has evolved even in the last 5-6 years. It has come leaps and bounds since the early 2000s. Well, thank you so much. That was a great talk. It was wonderful to have you. Up next, we will be having we'll be having a short break for about